Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Mysterium Coniunctionis. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, the link for my book where I teach you to do magic responsibly, and the link to get in touch with me personally through Connect so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of Mysterium Coniunctionis with Chapter 3, or Chapter 4, Part 3, an Alchemical Allegory. This is the third out of 4. It will again be a long one. The newcomer to the psychology of the unconscious will probably find the two texts about the mad dog and the thief very weird and abstruse. It's not that the dreams were weird, it was your definition of them that was weird, right? That it really did not bear any bearing at all to the dreams. Actually, they are no more so than the dreams which are daily fare of the psychotherapist, and, like dreams, they can be translated into rational speech. In order to interpret dreams, we need to understand some knowledge of the dreamer's personal situation, and to understand alchemical parables, we must know something about the symbolic assumptions of the alchemists. We amplify dreams by the personal history of the patient, and the parables by the statements found in the text. Armed with this knowledge, it is not too difficult in either case to discern a meaning that seems sufficient for our needs. An interpretation can hardly ever be convincingly proved. Generally, it shows itself to be correct only when it has proved its value as a heuristic hypothesis. I would therefore like to take the second of Phileletheus text, which is rather clearer than the first, and try to interpret it as if it were a dream. Oh boy. Alright, we're going to read the right-hand side of this. I'm not going to try to read the left hand. If thou knowest how to moisten this dry earth with its own water, thou wilt loosen the pores of the earth. We've already dealt with this allegory, right? I am positive that he is going to get it wrong, right? That's why I'm going to go ahead and do this. We dealt with this allegory yesterday about the dry earth being the allegory for your 5D temple, and the water being those electromagnetic forces that you can manipulate within. That does indeed loosen the pores of the earth so that you can advance, right? That is mental alchemy. That is how the process works. That is the manipulation of the energy up and through the stack. This is a direct correlation to that. This is exactly what I would expect to find. This is confirmation bias acknowledged, but this is exactly what I would say if this was my allegory. Now, he's probably not going to get it right. He did not get it right in the last one. It's probably not going to be right in this one. If you will contemplate your lack of fantasy, of inspiration and inner aliveness, which you feel as sheer stagnation and a barren wilderness, and impregnated with the interest born of alarm at your inner death, then something can take shape in you, for your inner emptiness conceals just as great a fullness, if you would only allow it to penetrate into you. Right? Not really. Not really. Right now, in part, yes, and I understand where he is coming from on a psychoanalytical standpoint, right? You should be able to clearly define the things that you want, right? You should be able to envision your future and the things that you want in your future. That would be a lack of fantasy if you are not doing so. Inspiration, even. Inner aliveness, even, because without direction, the inner aliveness dies. If you do not have a clearly defined point, it is very easy to wander off course and to lose that spark of inspiration, which is the inner aliveness. And so I understand where he is going with it and the reasons why, but it is not correct, right? Not for what is meant by that text, right? It works on a psychoanalytical point, right? Set your destination, work toward your goals, get your inner aliveness, feel that fire, that spark, which you feel as sheer stagnation in a barren wilderness. Again, that is just what I said. Clearly define your goals. Know where you want to go. Have the drive to get there. Push yourself even. And impregnate it with the interest born of your alarm at your inner death. That is self-reflection. That is part of it, but it is not the intrinsic part of it. This is a psychoanalytical part. This is not in accordance with alchemy. And then something can take shape in you, for the inner emptiness conceals just as great a fullness if you allow it to penetrate into you. That is true on the psychological level. But what is being stated by this text, right? If you know how to moisten the dry earth with its own water, thou wilt loosen the pores of the earth, is really literally, and I say this because of the video yesterday, this is talking about the manipulation of the electromagnetic forces of creation. If you read the text right here, A Beginner's Guide to the Mechanics of Electromagnetic Manipulation and an Energetic Manifestation. That is what this is talking about. This is a direct correlation to the things I talk about in the book. All right. If you prove receptive to this call of the wild, the longing for fulfillment will quicken the sterile wilderness of your soul as rain quickens the dry earth. Thus, the soul to the laborant, staring glumly at his stove and scratching himself behind the ear because he has no more ideas. And again, that works on the psychological level, right? If you are going through therapy, this is exactly what you would want your therapist to be telling you, right? But if you came to me for a direct consultation, I would be telling you different, right? This would be describing how to do what you are doing or what you can do, right? All right. And this thief from outside will be cast out with the workers of wickedness. All right, now the thief from outside is that outer sense of need that is not intrinsic to self, right? The process by which you can quicken yourself removes from you those other things, right? The process of coming into balance between all of the things, which is how you quicken that water, gets rid of the thief, right? What is the thief? Depression. What is the thief? Anxiety. What is the thief? Hostility. What is the thief? All of the negative concepts, right? That is the thief from outside. It will be cast out with the workers of wickedness. You are so sterile because without your knowledge, something like an evil spirit has stopped up the source of your fantasy, the fountain of your soul. The enemy is your own crude sulfur, which burns you with a hellish fire of desirousness or concupiscencia. You would like to make gold because poverty is the greatest plague, wealth the highest good. Footnote 339. Goethe de Schratzberger. All right. Again, this works on the psychological level, right? Something like an evil spirit, that's going to be on my side of things, has stopped up the source of your fantasy. That is not what has done it. It is you not doing your shadow work. That, right, in a psychoanalytical standpoint, is going back through the things that have happened into your life and doing causality on it, right? Both the things that are outside of your control in that event and the things that were inside of your control inside of that event. Not to blame yourself or even necessarily to blame others, but to root cause it, to get to the emotions that are behind it, which are then the drivers for other things in your life. If you go through a traumatic incident and you do not address it openly, honestly, talking about it, working through your feelings, and you suppress it, then this is where that evil spirit comes in. That is where those limitations come in. That is where not being able to define where you want to go comes in. That is where not being able to get up off of your ass and do the thing comes in, right? It is not some actual intrinsic evil force. It is you not dealing with your internal conflicts. Your internal conflicts will hold you back. And so this does indeed work, even somewhat on an alchemical level, right? Stopped at the source of your fantasy, the fountain of your soul. The enemy is your crude sulfur, that thing which you need to transmute, which burns you with a hellish fire of desirousness or concupiscencia. Right now, The hellish fire of desirousness is for all of the virtues and vices, both equally. You would like to make gold because poverty is the greatest plague, wealth the highest good. Now, we did not get much from that reference, but you would, right? Poverty does suck. If somebody is telling you that poverty is the way to go, they are lying to you. I have been impoverished multiple times in my life, right? I'm in a not abundant area, but I'm in a relatively safe place right now. My bills are paid. We don't have a whole lot of extra money, but it's not nearly as destitute as I have been. Right? When I was growing up, we were very poor. We were so poor that the welfare kids made fun of us. Right? We worked off of commodity boxes, food banks, and charity. Hand-me-down clothes, secondhand clothes. My entire childhood. Now, that is terrible. It is a horrible way to raise a child. It is not a great way to live. Most of the people in my family dealt with most of the same thing. Some of them were slightly better off. Most of them were around the same, right? It was a culture that is built. It is a plague, right? It holds you back because you associate yourself with it. And you set your limitations according to your expectations, and your expectations are set according to your current limits. And so it is a vicious cycle. It is a vicious circle that you have to intentionally break out of. Wealth, however, is not the highest good, right? It is a tool. It is a useful tool. You can use money for so much, but it is not the end goal for anything whatsoever. It should never be the end goal. It is a tool that you should desire, that you should use, but not to the point where that is your sole desire. All right. You wish to have results that flatter your pride. You expect something useful, but there can be no question of that, even as you have realized with a shock. Because of this, you no longer even want to be fruitful. And, well, as it would only be for God's sake, but unfortunately, not for your own. You wish to have results that flatter your pride. You expect something useful, but there can be no question of that, as you have realized with a shock. Because of this, you no longer even want to be fruitful. I don't like that at all. No. Right? Now, that it's not that it cannot be true, right? But this is not what is being said right here at all. Like, you cannot even make that out of this. The thief from outside will cast out with the workers of wickedness. What does that have to do with this, right? You wish to have results that flatter your pride. Where is that at? Where is that at? Is that the thief from outside wanting flattery? No. You expect something useful. You should expect something useful if you are doing things. But there can be no question of that, as you have realized with a shock. Why? Why can there be no question that you expect something useful? That's not in here, right? That is not in this block of text at all. There is no part of this paragraph in this little snippet at all. All of this is entirely outside of the bounds of this text. There is no part of that in this at all. And the water, by an admixture of the true sulfur, will be cleansed from the leprous filth and from the superfluous dropsical fluid. And again, that is in accordance with what I say. That is in accordance with what's in this book, right? I understand his lens is psychoanalysis, right? His lens is the current understanding that they had back in the 20s, which was not a good one, right? Not necessarily a bad one, but not a good understanding, right? That's what I'm saying. All right, see what he says. Therefore, away with your crude and vulgar desirousness, which childishly and short-sightedly sees only goals within its own narrow horizon. Admittedly, sulfur is a vital spirit, a Yetzer Hara, 340. So in Rucker's well-known poem, Hebrew Yetzer Hara means instinct of evil. We talked extensively about sulfur, how it is the Holy Spirit, and while it does contain what would be considered evil, right, it is not necessarily evil in the way that would be considered that. The death is a part of the process of life. Taking a life unnecessarily is evil, right? But that is intrinsic to the process as well, right? The free will that we have, the sacred contracts that we make, all of that is part of it. And it is therefore not intrinsically evil, even if the act is evil. I mean, I know that is a hard concept to wrap your mind around, but the bottlenecks are real, right? There are certain lessons that you simply cannot avoid, that you simply cannot make your way around. You have to pass through that to get to the next challenge on the other side. Without that particular experience, the next challenge will not work for you, right? So you do have to get through these things, no matter if they are evil or not. They are still evil, but it is not because of the spirit. It is because of the free will. It is because of the choices and the decisions that are made by the people who are incorporated. That is not intrinsic to the experience. That is intrinsic to the free will. And again, that is a close concept, right? The experience is the free will, but the experience is meant to be that you do not choose to do the evil act, but you have free will in order to choose to do the evil act, or else there is no point in having the choice, right? Sulfur is not it is a vital spirit, but it is not a Yetzer Hara, which is the spirit of evil. That is simply not true. That is simply not true at all. An evil spirit of passion, though, like this, an active element. And again, it is, right, your passions are not driven by a spirit of outside and external to you, right? You have your experience. Part of your experience is to overcome these passions. Some of them have an evil alignment, right? Stealing from someone, that is evil. It does not matter on what level it is. If it is two people and you steal from one of them, that is evil. If it is a corporation and you steal from the corporation, it is still evil. If you see somebody drop money and you pick it up, that is stealing, that is evil. Right? Now, if you're wandering down a road by yourself and there's a $20 bill on the ground and you pick that up, that is fortuitous. If you see somebody drop it and you pick it up and pocket it, that is evil, right? There is an intrinsic difference between the two. That is knowledge. So, right, your choices are not driven by some spirit outside of yourself. There is no devil in your ear telling you to do these things, and you have to comply. You get free choice, you get free will, you get to decide what you are going to do with your life. This is your experience. Your choice should be always to walk up the spiral, but it is freely your choice to walk down the spiral. Usefully, it is at times, useful as it is at times, it is an obstacle between you and your goal. The water of your interest is not pure. It is poisoned by the leprosy of desirousness, which is the common ill. And again, this is another problem. There is nothing wrong with desiring. There is nothing wrong with desiring money. There is nothing wrong with desiring sexual relations. There is nothing wrong with desiring fame and fortune. Right? Now, if that is your only desire, your only driver, then it can be a little bit evil. But you are meant to find the balance. You are meant to have things, and that does include sexual relations as well. Right? You should be in sacred union with a person. Some people, very few people are called to abstinence forever. Very few people are called to multiple partners. Those do exist, but they are exceedingly small. That is part of the experience as well. Most people are meant to find a person to share their soul with, and that is perfectly fine. There is nothing wrong with desiring to have sex with your partner. There is nothing wrong with desiring to have a drink of alcohol after you get off of work. There is nothing wrong with every once in a while over-consuming things that are no good for you. Nothing wrong with it. Now, if you make it a practice, it will have detrimental effects in your life. If you eat ice cream every day, you're probably going to pack on a little bit of weight. That's going to make it a little hard to breathe, a little hard to move around, to do some exercise. These are all real things, but there is nothing wrong with desire. This is an intrinsic misunderstanding about the experience that you are here for. If you were not meant to have desires, God would not have given you desires. You do have desires, and therefore there's nothing wrong with them, but they are meant to be controlled, not to control you. That is the major problem, right? This right here, poisoned by the leprosy of desirousness, is victim mentality. That is, wanting to blame something else for the actions that you should be taking. There is nothing leprous about desirousness. There is something leprous about it being your sole motivator. You too are infected with this collective sickness. Therefore, bethink you for once, extrahe cogitationem, and consider what is behind all this desirousness. A thirsting for the eternal, which, as you can see, can never be satisfied with the best because it is Hades, in whose honor the desirous go mad and rave. 341. Heraclitus. A thirsting for the eternal, right? That is, there is nothing wrong with that in the understanding that you will not live forever, right? There can be a problem with this thirsting for the eternal. If you are not living up to your true potential because you are self-limiting yourself because of some control system, right? We will use Christianity as an example because that is where I have come from. Jesus tells you to give away all that you own and come and follow me, right? In implicating that it is not good for you to desire to have things. That is a wrong teaching. Now, what he was trying to convey in that message was that your desire for those things should not be over the desire for you to do God's will. That seeking of the eternal is the correct one. If you are seeking an eternal life, you are doing it wrong, right? It is not about avoiding hell, because once again, hell is not a real concept, or going to heaven, because that, in the way that it is explained, is not a real concept either. There is the abode of God. We will return to that in my understanding. How that exactly plays out, I don't know. I believe that we came from the eternal. We will return to the eternal either way, and there is no burning condemnation for the bad decisions. I know, that's going to piss somebody off. Well, there has to be consequences or else people just go bad. They don't have to. I have that understanding. I am not choosing to go out there and do terrible things, right? That is an assumption that you are making based upon the control system that you were reared in. Your understanding of it is that if this eternal punishment is not there, then people will act in a bad way. But there is evidence that that has not always been the case, right? If you go back to Greece, well before Christ, there were moral systems then too. There was morality that existed completely outside of Judaism. There was morality that existed completely outside of Christianity and any concept thereof. People have been able to find morals throughout all of history, even without the control system that most of us who are watching this would have associated with themselves with at some point in time. A thirsting for the eternal is the thirsting to do the work of God here. That is okay. Doing the work with the expectation of a reward in heaven is prideful, even a little bit greedy. So you're hitting on two of the major sins right there. And you don't have to like that, but it is true, right? I have a quote in here from Ellie Modested. See if I can find it right there. And this quote says, "If you do good because you expect to be rewarded, it is greed." That is absolutely true. If you are doing good because you expect to be rewarded, not because it is good, not because it is the right thing to do, but because you expect a reward, even in heaven, that is greed. You are acting with the wrong motivations, and therefore you will get the wrong fruit. The more you cling to that which all the world desires, the more you are, every man, who has not yet discovered himself and stumbles through the world like a blind man, leading the blind with somnambulistic certainty into the ditch. And again, that is in part true. As I have hit so hard in this chapter today, I guess this is what we do in materialism today. There is nothing wrong with wanting things. There is absolutely something wrong with wanting all of the things. There is nothing wrong with giving away things, but there is something wrong with giving away all of the things. You should have desires, even worldly desires. That is why God gave them to you. Some of them, however, you should deny. That is why God gave you free will, the choice, and the ability to cognate. Dogs don't have that decision to make. If they are presented with something, They take advantage of it. Humans have the ability to discern differently, right? And so, once again, the more you cling to that which all the world desires is in part true. That is absolutely in part true, but it is not absolutely true. Every man is always a multitude. Cleanse your interest of that collective sulfur which clings to all like a leprosy, for desire only burns in order to burn itself out. And in and from this fire arises the true living spirit, which generates life according to its own laws and is not blinded by the short-sightedness of our intentions or the crude presumption of our superstitious belief in the will. Goethe says, "That livingness I praise which longs for flaming death." 342. Westosterdewan. This means burning in your own fire and not being like a comet or a flashing beacon, showing others the right way but not knowing it yourself. Now that is true as well. If you are out there being a beacon, you should set yourself the highest standards possible and hold yourself to them. I do so, right? I talk about that quite often. My standards are here, right out of reach, or almost out of reach, where I can grab them, but I really got to work for it, right? That is where I set my standards, to take the correct action with the correct thought and the correct word as much as I possibly can. Do I fail in that? Absolutely. I still have problems with anger. This last couple of weeks here on the planet have been rather rough, right? Especially if you were on the side of right. It has been a rough couple of weeks. It is hard to see on the other side of it. I do, but most people don't. Especially those who are considered to be, they consider themselves to be aligned correctly, right? Today is September the 26th, and we are 3 days past the last rapture event, right? Well, we're going to get raptured on the 23rd of September. No, right? Number one, the Bible is not real, right? It is real, but it's not true. It has truth. It is not the truth. But on top of that, there is no rapture in the Bible. That is a thing. There is an apocalypse. That is true. It is even fairly close to what will happen. But it was interpreted through the lens of the people who were given the prophecies. That is one of the problems with prophecy. We discussed that quite extensively. And so you should be aligning yourself in a way that you are an example, right? That's where I was going with that. I try, I fail, but I try to, like, in my interpersonal relationships, it is a lot easier than it is on the internet, right? I'm scrolling through the various social media platforms and I see absolute disgusting things, right? Saying that it is okay for someone to get killed for speaking. If you believe that, you are wrong. You need to readjust your life quite drastically. That the most recent example is this whole Tylenol thing, right? That there has been an ongoing study for a decade or so. I'm not sure on the exact timing, but it was an extensive study by like 10 different universities over about a decade. They reached conclusions, and those conclusions were relayed by the current Homeland or the Health Secretary, which is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And because it was relayed by him, there is a negative connotation and people are out there seriously destroying themselves, right? Seeing that, to me, is angering, right? It is not the information that you have the problem with. It is who has relayed that, but then you attack the information. That is always going to be a problem for me, right? When I am doing this, when I'm talking shit about Eliphas Levi, it is about the things that he is relaying, not necessarily him, although he was not a wonderful human being. The same thing with Crowley. They made terrible decisions for their entire life, with very few exceptions. But it's not about them, it's about the decisions that they made and then relayed onto you. That's what got me so mad about it. You should set your bar high. If you are meaning to be an example, I set myself out as an example. That's why I'm using myself, right? That what I am doing on this channel is that I am setting myself up as an example, right? That comes with some very severe consequences if I misalign. I am fully aware of that. I am willing to take that risk. But I do fail. I understand that completely. I know what I am doing. When I express myself, it is always with intention. But I do succumb, right? Seeing this stuff on social media has set me off, right? I'm like, you're fucking stupid, right? That's my most common comment. I try not to get too wild, but I'm like, YFS. That is as far as I go. I'm like, you're fucking stupid. That's what YFS means if you ever come across it. And so that is something that I am working on. That is my anger, right? That is me, even in righteous anger, not expressing it correctly, and I need to work on that. That's setting that bar up here. That is me falling beyond that bar. That is not burning your own fire and being like a comet, right? You see that better expressed in some of these virtue signalers. They're out here telling you this is the right way, but it is absolutely not. And again, I bring you the Tylenol example. The unconscious demands your interest for its own sake and wants to be accepted for what it is. Once the existence of this opposite is accepted, the ego can and should come to terms with its demands. Unless the content given you by the unconscious is acknowledged, its compensatory effect is not only nullified, 343. Naturally, this is true only during the process of coming to terms with the unconscious. Unless the content given you by the unconscious is acknowledged, its compensatory effect is not only nullified, but actually changes into its opposite and then tries to realize itself literally and concretely. When I was talking about the self-reflection earlier, this is what I was talking about, right? If you do not take that information given to you by your unconscious and acknowledge it, that is the shadow work. That information is your feelings. Whenever you review, this event happened to me on X date, right? Whatever feelings that brings up is your unconscious talking to you. If it is sadness, there is something you need to address about letting go of regret. If it is anger, there is something about love that you need to get into there, right? There is a counterbalance to all of the emotions, and you are meant to feel your emotions so that you can learn what the counterbalance is and thereby balance your emotions, right? Me acknowledging my wrath, trying to act with more love is how I do it, right? And I know making the comment is not the way to do it, but trust me when I tell you that that is a lot lighter than the comment that I want to leave. And yes, that is from someone who claims to be an adept, right? From someone who has done things that have led to positive physical effects in my own life. These are things that have actually happened. I have healed myself. Unless the content given to you by the unconscious is acknowledged, its compensatory effect is not only nullified, but actually changes into its opposite. That is another very important part to remember. And thou wilt have in thy power the fount of the Knight of Treviso, whose waters are rightfully dedicated to the maiden Diana. And again, that is talking about my interior work, right? Not necessarily psychotherapy. The fountain of Bernardus Trevisanus is the bath of renewal that was mentioned earlier. That is the flow of the electromagnetic forces. That is what that is. The ever-flowing fountain expresses a continual flow of interest towards the unconscious, a kind of constant attention, or religio, which might also be called devotion. The crossing of unconscious contents into consciousness is thus made considerably easier, and this is bound to benefit the psychic balance of the long run. Diana, as the numen and nymph of this spring, is an excellent formulation of the figure we know as the anima. If attention is directed to the unconscious will yield up its contents, and these, in turn, will fructify the conscious like a fountain of living water. Wonder if we've heard that reference somewheres before. Fountain of living water. I wonder what that could possibly be. For consciousness is just as arid as the unconscious if the two halves of our psychic life are separated. And I agree with that, right? Your consciousness is just as arid as the unconscious if the two halves of our psychic life are separated. Wealthless is the thief, armed with the malignity of arsenic, from whom the winged youth fleeth, shuddering. Again, that is going to be the virtues and vices out of balance. It is evidently a difficult thing, this cleansing from leprous filth. Indeed, D'Espagnier calls it the labor of Hercules. That is why the text turns back to the thief at this point. The thief, as we saw, personifies a kind of self-robbery. He is not easily shaken off, as it comes from a habit of thinking supported by tradition and milieu alike. Anything that cannot be exploited, I lost my spot, in some way is uninteresting, hence the devaluation of the psyche. A further reason is the habitual depreciation of everything one cannot touch with the hands, or does not understand. In this respect, our conventional system of education, necessary as it was, is not entirely free from the blame of having helped to give the empirical psyche a bad name. God knows that is true. In recent times, this traditional error has been made even worse by an allegedly biological point of view, which sees man as being no further advanced than a herd animal, and fails to understand any of his motivations outside of the categories of hunger, power, and sex. We think in terms of thousands and millions of units, and then, naturally, there are no questions more important than whom the herd belongs to, where it pastures, whether enough calves are born, and sufficient quantities of milk and meat are produced. In the face of huge numbers, every thought of individuality pales, for statistics obliterate everything unique. Contemplating such overwhelming might and misery, the individual is embarrassed to exist at all. Yet the real carrier of life is the individual. He alone feels happiness. He alone has virtue and responsibility and any ethics whatever. The masses and the state have nothing of the kind. Only man as an individual human being lives. The state is just a system, a mere machine for sorting and tabulating the masses. Anyone, therefore, who thinks in terms of men, minus the individual, in huge numbers, atomizes himself and becomes a thief and a robber to himself. He is infected with leprosy of collective thinking and has become an inmate of that insalubrious stud farm called the totalitarian state. Our time contains and produces more than enough of that crude sulfur with which our cynical malignity prevents man from discovering his true self. I was tempted to translate arsenicalis as poisonous, but this translation would be too modern. Not everything that the alchemists called arsenic was really the chemical element as. Arsenic originally meant masculine, manly, strong, and was essentially an arcanum, as Ruland's lexicon shows. There, arsenic is defined as a hermaphrodite, the means whereby sulfur and mercury are united. It has communion with both natures and is therefore called sun and moon. Footnote 344. 344 says, page 49. Oh, wrong book. Once again, I will point out that any time that it is talking about sun and moon, it is talking about the oneness, the positive and negative, the masculine and feminine, both in conjunction, working together equally in balance, called the sun and the moon. Or arsenic is Luna, our Venus, sulphur's companion, and the soul. And that is not going to be good. Here, arsenic is no longer the masculine aspect of the arcane substance, but it is hermaphroditic and even feminine. Those are not the same thing. This brings, like, the hermaphroditic assumption is the balance that is meant, right? The balance between the positive and the negative, the masculine and feminine, not an actual hermaphrodite. And the hermaphrodite is both masculine and feminine. It is neither masculine nor feminine. This brings it dangerously close to the moon and crude sulfur, so that arsenic loses its solar affinity. As sulfur's companion, it is poisonous and corrosive. Because the arcane substance always points to the principal unconscious content, its peculiar nature shows in what relation that content stands to consciousness. If the conscious mind has accepted it, it has a positive form. If not, a negative one. If, on the other hand, the arcane substance is split into two figures, this means that the content has been partly accepted and partly rejected. It is seen under two different incompatible aspects and is therefore taken to be two different things. This is what has happened in our text. No, it is not. The thief is contrasted with the winged youth, who represents the other aspect or personifies the true sulfur, the inner spirit of inner truth, which measures man not by his relation to the mass, but by his relation to the mystery of the psyche. This winged youth, the spiritual Mercurius, is obviously aware of his own weakness and flees, shuddering, from crude sulfur. The standpoint of the inner man is the more threatened, the more overpowering that of the outer man is. Sometimes only his invisibility saves him. He is so small that no one would miss him if he were not the sine qua non of the inner peace and happiness. Footnote 345. In outward forms thou'lt not find unity, thine eye must ever introverted be. Canst thou forget thyself to all forlorn, thou wilt feel God in thee, well and truly one. Terstegen. That is true, right? In outward forms thou not find unity. Now that is not entirely true because everything is literally one, right? The Holy Spirit is quite literally everything in existence all at the same time, but we are defined as ourselves inside of that spirit. We have our temple. And so, outward forms you will not find unity. Okay, thine eye must ever be introverted. True, you should be looking inside of yourself to improve yourself into who you want to be. Canst thou forget thyself to all forlorn, thou feel God in thee, well and truly one. When I seek him outside, God makes me bad, only with salvation to be had. And again, right, the inner work is what makes it right. When you seek outward validation, then you will be validated by sources that may not be correct. If you are seeking inward validation, that validation comes from your understanding of the one. But if you are continuously seeking improvement, that improvement will be revealed to you. And so when you seek it internally, introverted B, you will find that which you need to improve. All right. In the last resort, it is neither the 80 million strong nation nor the state that feels peace and happiness, but the individual. That is mostly true, right? There is no peace in multitudes. There will always be contention. It is part of the experience. And so, in part, that is at least true, but there is a sense of unanimity, right? Back in my day, back when I was a kid, we were relatively okay, right? Before the Gulf War kicked off, the end of Vietnam and the Gulf War, there was a period of relative peace. You could say that the nation kind of felt that then. Not entirely. The 80s were probably the closest we came to national unity at all. Ever since like the 2008 or so, everything's been going downhill in that particular area. Nobody can ever get around the simple computation that a million knots in a row do not add up to one, just as the loudest talk can never abolish the simple psychological fact that the larger the mass, the more nugatory is the individual. True, right? The more that there is the aggregate, the more the individual matters. That's what this is saying, right? Or the more the differentiation from the individual from the mass will be. That is what it is saying. The shy and delicate youth stands for everything that is winged in the psyche or would like to sprout wings, but it dies from the poison of organizational thinking and mass statistics. The individual succumbs to the madness that sooner or later overtakes every mass, the death instinct of the lemmings. In the political sphere, the name for this is war. Now, this is not intrinsically true. right? Organizational structure, organizational thinking, mass statistics, in and of themselves, there is nothing wrong with that. It is in the application where we run into problems, right? There is nothing wrong with having a governmental system by which you pay taxes, right? Paying taxes is a privilege. I know that sets people off, but it is true. It is a privilege to be able to pay a tax and have things taken care for you without your concern. That is true. Being able to pay for the roads to be made without you personally being responsible for it is a privilege, not an imposition, right? We have agreed that we will pay these taxes for these things. The problem comes from the execution. It comes from us not holding to account our elected representatives to spend the money that we give them in the appropriate way. That is where the problem with taxes is. If you were paying taxes and there were no potholes in your road, that we had a 90+% graduation rate with intelligence ensuing, people would not have problems with taxes. The problem with taxes is, I pay these taxes and the roads are shit. I pay these taxes and the schools are shit. That is true. That is true. But that is responsibility, right? That is in the execution, not in the system. The system is fine. It is the execution of the system that is the problem. It is the individual responsibility of you and me and every single citizen of the nation to ensure that our elected representatives are representing us in the way that they should. That is our responsibility. And you know what that is? That is the other half of rights. If you want rights, you have to take responsibility. You don't just get to idle through and not vote and then expect the elected representatives to listen to you. You have to take responsibility to ensure that it is going in the correct way. Rights and responsibilities are inseparable. Back to the text. And though the central water is his bride, yet dare he not display his most ardent love towards her because of the snares of the thief, whose machinations and truth are unavoidable. Now this one, let's step on some toes. What I describe in this book, the manipulation of the electromagnetic forces of creation through these chakras, that is the central water. That is the living life flow. That is the everlasting waters. That is the waters of life. That is the thing that refreshes. That is the thing that renews. That is the thing that brings back to life. It is the living waters. It is the central waters, right? And if you have made it your bride, as I have, right? I have a wife. I am perfectly happy with that. But I have made the central water my bride, the Holy Spirit. The decisions that I make are intrinsically linked to me attempting to be a better husband to that bride, right? What is being said right here, and though the central water is his bride, even though you are committed to this particular path, yet dare he not display his most ardent love towards her, because of the snares of the thief, whose machinations are in truth unavoidable. That is the control systems, right? There are very real control systems that just a couple of 100 years ago, if I would have written this particular book, they would have burned me at a stake, and that would have been the easy way to go. They had all kinds of different ways to burn me for doing what God has enabled me to do, right? That is the thief. The thief is the control system that takes away from you your love of that central water. Now, I am currently, right now, in the process of embracing that more openly every single day, right? When people ask me what I do these days, it is an interesting answer, right? I teach people how to do magic on the internet. I read tarot cards, right? 6 months ago, that wasn't something that I would have been saying, right? I would have told them, oh, I'm on disability. That would have been the end of the conversation. Nowadays, I am working my way off of disability. I am working on healing myself in some very real ways. And so I am stepping outside of that control system. I no longer am I am no longer restricted by the beliefs of other people to keep me from professing and displaying my love for the central waters. The goal of the winged youth is a higher one than the fulfillment of collective ideals, which are all nothing but makeshifts and conditions for bare existence. Since this is the absolute foundation, nobody will deny their importance, but collective ideals are not, by a long way, the breath of life which man needs in order to live. If his soul does not live, nothing can save him from stultification. His life is the soil in which his soul can and must develop. He has only the mystery of his living soul to set against the overwhelming might and brutality of the collective convictions. It is the age-old drama of opposites, no matter what they are called, which is fought out in every life. The drama of the opposites, described. In our text, it is obviously the struggle between the good and the evil spirit, expressed in alchemical language, just as today we express it in conflicting ideologies. The text comes close to the mystical language of Baroque, the language of Jacob Boehme, Abraham of Frankenberg, and Angelius Silesius. We learn that the winged youth is espoused to the central water. This is the fountain of the soul, or the fount of wisdom. I would say spirit, but he has a different understanding of soul and spirit than I do. I would say it is the fountain of the spirit because I identify the spirit as the living waters. Right? 346. And it is indeed the fount of wisdom. Book of Enoch, 48. Oh boy. Fountains of wisdom, all the thirsty drank of them. Charles, Apocrypha, and Pseudo-Epigraphia. I have done a study of the Book of Enoch. It is available if you are interested. There is not much value in it. I know, that stepped on some toes, but that toe I do not care about in the slightest. This is the fountain of the soul, or the fountain of wisdom, from which the inner life wells up. The nymph of the spring is, in the last analysis, Luna, the mother beloved, from which it follows that the winged youth is soul, the filius solus, lapis aurum philosophorum, lumen luminum, medicina catholica, una salus, etc. We have discussed those terms. It is the heart. He is the best, the highest, the most precious in potentia. But he will become real only if he can unite with Luna, the mother of mortal bodies. If not, he is threatened with the fate of the pure Eternus in Faust, who goes up in smoke 3 times. 347. Boy, charioteer, homunculus, and euphorion. We have not done a study of Faust. The adept must therefore always take care to keep the hermetic vessel well sealed, in order to prevent what is in it from flying away. The content becomes fixed through the mystery of the Coniunctio, in which the extreme opposites unite. Night is wedded with day, and the two shall be one. Yes, indeed. The two shall be one in the outside as the inside, and the male with the female, neither male nor female. 348. Clement of Rome, second epistle to the Corinthians. This apocryphal saying of Jesus from the beginning of the 2nd century is indeed a paradigm of the alchemical union of opposites. The apocryphal saying of Jesus from 200 AD? No, sir. No, sir, that didn't happen. Obviously, this problem is an eschatological one. Yes, it is. But aside from the somewhat torturous language of the time, it cannot be called abstruse, but since it has universal validity, from the Tao Lao Tzu to the Coincidentia Oppositorium of Cusanius. Alright, well, we have not done a full study of the Tao, but we did a short one just prior to this, and while there is some knowledge that can be extracted from it, there are some things that are definitely not knowledge that is contained within it. If that is interesting to you, we did, I think, 3 or 4 days of reading it before it was not serving a purpose. I have not read the Coincidentia Oppositorium of Cusanius, right? But using it as universal validity because of the Tao is not going to be right. The Tao is self-contradictory. Just like the Bible is, right? The Bible is self-contradictory quite often, very often within the same chapter in the same book. And if that pisses you off, I will refer you to the Bible study where you can watch me read it to you and then get pissed off. The same idea penetrated into Christianity in the form of the apocalyptic marriage of the Lamb, and we seldom find a high point of religious feeling where this eternal image of the royal marriage does not appear. We will not get into the apocalyptic marriage of the Lamb. If you are interested in that, I have done a study of Revelation. I can do no more than demonstrate the existence of this image and its phenomenology. What the union of opposites really means transcends human imagination. Therefore, the worldly wise can dismiss such a fantasy without further ado, for it is perfectly clear. Tertium non datur. But that doesn't help us much, for we are dealing with an eternal image, an archetype, from which man can turn away his mind for a time, but never permanently. 349. This has been shown once again in our own day by the solemn promulgation of the dogma of the Assumption. A Catholic author aptly remarks, "There seems to be some strange rightness in the betrayal of this reunion in splendor of son and mother, father and daughter, spirit and matter. In this connection, it is worth recalling the words of Pope Pius XII's Apostolic Constitution, Munificentissimus Deus. On this day, the Virgin Mother was taken up to her heavenly bridal chamber." No. Anthony of Padua, Sermo in Assumptio de Mare Virginis. That is not a thing in the Bible, right? There was, at no point in the Bible was the Virgin Mary brought up into heaven. On top of that, in the Old Testament, there is no prophecy of a virgin birth. Yeah, that's going to set somebody off, but it is a true thing. Go back to Isaiah. Read it for yourself. But there is no point in there at all where the Virgin Mary is taken up to her heavenly bridal chamber. At all. That is not in the literal text. Right? Now, you can make those assumptions. You can make those extrapolations. If you make the other assumptions, right? Jesus had to die for your sins. That is an assumption. It is not true, but it is an assumption. That there is an eternal punishment waiting for you, and therefore these things had to play out. Right? Not true, but it is something you can assume. You can assume that the Virgin Mother was taken up to her heavenly bridal chamber. Some people maintain that this married woman never had sexual relations for the entirety of her life just because she happened to give virginal birth to the Savior of mankind. That limited her from having sexual relations with her husband. People really believe that. People really believe that Mary was a virgin until the day she died. That is almost certainly not going to happen. Even if, by some miracle, and it would be a miracle, there was a virgin birth, didn't happen. Even if it was true, right? There is no reason to assume that she stayed that way, especially since there is references to her having children in the Bible. Like, outside of Jesus, he had at least a brother and a sister. Like, did she not have sex? Was they all virgin births? Like, people make all kinds of weird assumptions based upon these things that they do not research. Right now, the Catholic Church emphatically, for generations, like hundreds, if not thousands of years, did not want you to read the book. They wanted to read the book to you. It was the Protestant Revolution, or the Reformation, which brought about your capacity to be able to read the book for yourself. Right? To be able to go in and say, oh, well, this doesn't say anything like what the priest is saying, which is the logical conclusion if you read the book. Back to the text. Whenever this image is obscured, his life loses its proper meaning and consequently its balance. So long as he knows that he is the carrier of life and that it is therefore important for him to live, then the mystery of his soul lives also, no matter whether he is conscious of it or not. But if he no longer sees the meaning of his life and its fulfillment, and no longer believes in man's eternal right to this fulfillment, then he has betrayed and lost his soul, substituting for it a madness which leads to destruction, as our time demonstrates all too clearly. The machinations of the thief, our texts say, are unavoidable. They are an integral part of the fateful drama of opposites, just as the shadow belongs to the light. I tell you that all of the time, that these obstacles are intentional. That the bad things that happen have a purpose, even if you cannot see it immediately. There is some value to be extracted from it, no matter how horrible it is. I understand that's going to set some people off. See the origin story for that. And so it is absolutely the machinations of the thief. That is the temptations of the world. That is the things that are tempting you to overconsume the virtues or the vices. And it is unavoidable. Your response to it, however, is not unavoidable. That part is free choice. An integral part of the fateful drama of opposites? Yes. Without it does not happen. Reason, however, cannot turn this into a convenient recipe, for inevitability does not diminish the guilt of what is evil, any more than the merit of what is good. Now, this is one of those points where I am contentious, and most people are not in concordance with me. Right? I believe that there is a reason for all of the things. Reason can turn this into a convenient recipe, for inevitability does not diminish, right, the guilt of what is evil or the merit of what is good. Okay, fine, right? But you can understand what the point was, right? I will use myself as an example, as I so often do, right? I was molested when I was a child, right? That was not my responsibility. But as a soul, I decided to be the temptation for this man. As the temptation for this man, he was meant to decide not to. But he didn't. And because he didn't, the bottlenecks that came into my life, which were unavoidable, was a sense of sexual desire that I did not understand, right? An all-consuming, because that affection really got messed up, right? Anger and wrath, because of these emotions that were suppressed because of the situation that happened. The good that comes out of that is that I get to learn how to not do the things that now are part of my experience, right? Because of the thing that happened to me, there is the temptation to continue it. Not anymore, but when it happened, until I did the shadow work. Now, it is not even a thing, right? But if I did not do the shadow work, if I did not overcome, if I did not work my way towards it, then I could succumb to temptations which are not meant for me. Now, to be abundantly clear, I have never been attracted to children as a grown man, right? But when I was a child, there were several problems in my life that were related to sexual decisions with other children my age. It was not adults at that point. It was me and another child. As a child, dealing with children. It was not a grown folk situation, right? My overcoming of that was while I was still a child. And so I'm not trying to intimate, somebody might extrapolate, right? I don't at all have any sexual desire. Like, I don't even like younger women, right? My wife is 4 years younger than me. That is about the limits, right? I'm almost 50 years old. If something were to happen today and my wife was not here, if I decided to redo, it would not be with a woman that was 30, right? It would not be with a woman that was 40. I want somebody close to my age. That is my desires. But that all required working through things. All right. And so you can find inside of the experience where the good is to come from. That is the point of the experience. Even the negative ones, right? Sometimes the experience is to have the bad experience. Right? God doesn't know grief except through you. Everything is to him is eternal. All the souls return to him. How's he going to grieve something that comes immediately back to him? He doesn't know what that is. But through us, the mortal, he can have an understanding of what it is like to grieve. It is the same for all of these desires. It is the same for pain, right? Sometimes it is to die young and painfully. That is an experience that the eternal cannot have outside of us. Sometimes that is the answer. That is an extremely hard answer to understand. Sometimes the lesson is grief. Sometimes you will lose your child. Sometimes you will lose your spouse. Sometimes you will lose the ability to move. Right? All of that is intrinsic to the experience, and you are to find the good in it. And I know, that is hard work. Minus remains minus, and guilt as ever has to be avenged. Evil follows after wrong, says the Capuchin friar in Wallenstein's camp. Guilt does not necessarily have to be avenged, right? It is understandable where that is coming from, but sometimes forgiveness is not avengement, right? And if you look at the recent activities, some woman lost her husband in a particularly gruesome way, and she still found a way to forgive that person. That is a lesson for humanity. Evil does not have to follow after wrong. Sometimes correction can. A banal truth that is too readily forgotten, and because of this winged youth cannot lead his bride home as quickly as he would wish. Evil cannot be eradicated once and for all. It is an inevitable component of life, and it is not to be had without paying for it. Truth. The thief, whom the police do not catch, has nevertheless robbed himself, and the murderer is his own executioner. Remember I told you that if you steal from the corporation, it is still stealing? The thief is nevertheless robbing himself. The thief in our text is armed with all evil, but in reality it is merely the ego with its shadow where the abysmal depths of human nature begin to appear. Increasing psychological insight hinders the projection of the shadow, and this gain in knowledge logically leads to the problem of the union of the opposites. One realizes first of all that one cannot project one shadow onto others, and next that there is no advantage in insisting on their guilt, as it is so much more important to know and possess one's own, because it is part of one's own self and a necessary factor without which nothing in this sublunary world can be realized. And this particular, 2 sentences right here? One sentence. This one sentence right here, this is the difference between Freud and Jung. Right here, right? Jung is about putting the blame on someone else. Or Jung is about assuming the blame for yourself. That's what this sentence is. Freud is about assigning to someone else that blame, right? Not working through your shadow, but looking at someone else's, insisting on their guilt. It is the intrinsic difference between the two psychological systems, and Freud, in his definition of these things, is our current problem in society. Most of these people who have no ability to regulate themselves whatsoever are going to therapy to Freudian therapists. Though it is not said that Luna personifies the dark side, there is, as we have seen, something very suspicious about the new moon. Nevertheless, the winged youth loves his moon bride and hence the darkness to which she belongs, for the opposites not only flee one another, but also attract one another. We all know that evil, especially if it is not scrutinized too closely, can be very attractive, and most of all when it appears in idealistic garb. Ostensibly, it is the wicked thief that hinders the youth in his love for the chaste Diana. But in reality, the evil is already lurking in the ideal youth and in the darkness of the new moon, and his chief fear is that he might discover himself in the role of the common sulphur. This role is so shocking that the noble-minded youth cannot see himself in it and puts the blame on the wiles of the enemy. It is as if he dared not know himself because he is not adult enough to accept the fact that one must be thankful if one comes across an apple without a worm in it and a plate of soup without a hair. Yeah, you should be thankful you can eat around a worm. You can remove a hair. That set somebody off. Here, may Diana be propitious to thee, who knoweth how to tame wild beasts. Would that be self-reflection? I bet it would. The darkness which is opposed to the light is the unbridled instinctuality of nature that asserts itself despite all consciousness. Yeah, anyone who seeks to unite the opposites certainly needs Diana to be propitious to him, for she is being considered as a bride, and it has yet to be seen what she has to present in the way of wild animals. Possibly the thief will appear quite insignificant by comparison. And whose twin doves will temper the malignity of the air with their wings? Again, I will remind you that these twin doves, the one with wings or the one with feathers and the one without, is the as above and the as below forces that are described in this book. The tender pair of doves is an obviously harmless aspect of the same instinctuality, though in itself the ethereomorphic symbol would be capable of an interpretation from above downwards and from downwards up, right? And it goes both ways. The light dove, the dark dove, the feathered dove, the featherless dove. That allegory we discussed in some length yesterday is the light and dark forces. The same thing that we were talking about. Nonetheless, it should not be interpreted in this sense because the aspect of untamed animality and evil is represented in the previous quotation by the mad dog, and in this one by the thief. That is right. The thief is the darker energies, yes, but the doves represent both, the as above and the as below. That is the correlation that he is missing right here. In contrast to this, the doves are emblems of innocence and marital love, as well as of the Holy Ghost and Sapientia, of Christ and his Virgin Mother, 350. And also of gentleness, tameness, peacefulness, the dove of Noah, simplicity, from Matthew, guileless as doves. Christ too is called a dove. The Lord Jesus was a dove, saying, Peace be unto you. Behold the dove, behold the green olive branch in its mouth. Fernandius cited in Penselius. Penselius calls Mary the most pure dove. The Aureum Velis interprets the dove as follows. Wherefore the prophet crieth, Who will give me wings like a dove? That is to say, spotless and simple thoughts and contemplations. All right. Now, these are things that have been attributed, but this is not the same allegory. Right? We saw yesterday quite clearly what was being described by that. This is not the same, even though it uses the same symbology. That is a problem that is held by the symbologist. It is one of the things that I talk about when we talk about the Masons and their symbology. They assume that they know what that means. But there are at least two cases that they don't. We have discussed them before. It's already getting long. I'm not going to today. But they don't have a full understanding of their own symbology. They do things without the knowledge of what they are doing. And that is this problem right here, right? That symbology of the doves that we got yesterday was quite explicit about one being above and flying and one being below and not having wings, not having feathers, right? That allegory was a direct correlation to the as above and the as below principles. These allegories are assuming that because the terminology, the symbology is the same with the doves, that the message is the same, and it is not. It is not at all. This is a completely different interpretation of what the doves mean than what we saw yesterday, and what is being talked about right here. This is a reference to what we talked about yesterday that is explicit from the text. He did not have that understanding. I understand that that is my understanding, and it may not be correct, but to me it is glaringly obvious. It leaps off the page. There is no way that I can make that mistake, right? I cannot return to the wrong interpretation. Anything containing this part. Back to the text. From this context, we can see what the dove is intended to represent. It is the exact counterpoint to the malignity of the thief. No. See this word right here? This is not the counterpoint. All right, where we go? Quotation, nonetheless, it should not be interpreted in this sense, because the aspect of the untamed animality and evil is represented in the previous quotation by the mad dog. Oh wait, we're down here. The exact counterpoint to the malignity of the thief. That would be the water. The exact counterpoint of the malignity of the thief is the water. From this text, right? The water is what drives out the thief, not the doves. The water. The doves are what you get after you have watered the vessel with the water and driven out the thief. They represent the attack, first from one side and then from the other, of a dualistic being on a more restricted consciousness of man. The purpose or result of this assault is the widening of consciousness, which has always, it seems, followed the pattern laid down in Genesis 3:4. Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know the day, that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. That was indeed a widening of consciousness, and once again I will point out that there are only two possibilities for the tree. Either God put the tree there with the full knowledge that they would eat from the tree, or he was ignorant that they could eat from the tree. There is no differentiation, but there is no other way of looking at it. Eve was not given direct instructions not to eat from the tree. She was not with Adam whenever she got the fruit from the tree. Adam did eat the fruit after she had picked it. But that entire situation implies that either God knew that they would eat from the tree because they did not know the difference between good and evil. Evil would be disobeying the instructions of God, and if you do not know that it is evil to disobey the instructions of God, right, it is a cycle. It is a loop that is unescapable. Either God was ignorant and had no idea that these people could do this, which is a repeated pattern through the rest of the book, by the way, or he did it with the full knowledge that they would eat from this tree. There is no other way of looking at it. Just like there is no other way of looking at it, then there are two types of pastors. There are either the pastors that are too stupid to put together the pieces, or there are the pastors that put together the pieces and are lying to you anyway. It is, obviously, a moment of supreme possibilities both for good and for evil. Usually, however, it is first one and then the other. The good man succumbs to evil, the sinner is converted to good, and that, to an uncritical eye, is the end of matter. But those endowed with a finer moral sense or deeper insight cannot deny that this seeming one after another is in reality a happening of events side by side. And perhaps no one has realized this more clearly than St. Paul, who knew that he bore a thorn in the flesh, and that the messenger of Satan smote him in the face, lest he be exalted above measure. 3:51. 2 Corinthians. Now, I have all kinds of problems with Paul. I'm not going to really dive into it today, but it is very, very important to note that Paul's experience with Jesus or God is exactly the same as mine. He never once met the man in person. He met him in a spiritual experience, fine, but that was an entity identifying itself as Jesus. It may or may not have been the actual Jesus. Right? There is no way of knowing that. Paul was in direct contention with the entirety of everyone who ever studied at the foot of Jesus. He was given an entirely, completely different doctrine, and that is evident from the text in the New Testament. The one after another is a bearable prelude to the deeper knowledge of the side by side, and this is an incomparably more difficult problem. Again, the view that good and evil are spiritual forces outside us, and that man is caught in the conflict between them, is more bearable by far than the insight that the opposites are the ineradicable and indispensable preconditions of all psychic life, so much so that life itself is guilt. Even a life dedicated to God is still lived by an ego, which speaks of an ego and asserts an ego in God's despite, which does not instantly merge itself with God, but reserves for itself a freedom and a will which it sets up outside of God and against him. That is not intrinsically true. Even a life dedicated to God is still lived by an ego. That is true. You are still making the decisions. Which speaks of an ego. Yes, that is saying that you have a soul which is synonymous with ego. It is the part that makes the decisions. And asserts an ego in God's despite is the problem, right? How is it in God's despite to assert your ego in a life dedicated to God? It is not. That is an intrinsic misunderstanding. It does not instantly submerge itself with God. True, you still have your complications. Remember me talking about my comments on social media? But reserves for itself a freedom and a will, which it sets up outside of God and against Him. So you, the ego, set up yourself outside of God? God didn't differentiate your soul into your vessel. God didn't decide that you were going to be created. God didn't give you your hopes, dreams, and desires. That wasn't God. That was outside of God? Is that what you're trying to tell me? You're wrong. Now, can you do that? Yes. Right? You can align yourself in that way, but not if you are dedicated to Him. If you are dedicated to God, then you are not setting yourself up outside of God and against Him. You are endeavoring to find your way to Him and to do His will. Can you misinterpret that? Absolutely. You are not divine. But that doesn't mean that it is intrinsic to it at all. That is a complete misunderstanding. How can it do this against the overwhelming might of God? Only through self-assertion, which is as sure of its free will as Lucifer. And there is one of those problems, right? Lucifer is not co-equal to God. Lucifer was a creation, the creation of God. He was not co-equal to God at any point, ever. Even thinking himself so, as is the legend, is not the same thing. God is existent outside of creation. He has limited himself into creation. And while creation is entirely of God, it is not the entirety of God. Just as you are a creation of God, but you are not the entirety of God. That is a true thing, right? And so, only through self-assertion, which is as sure of its free will as Lucifer, if you are aligning yourself against God, that is prideful and can be associated with Lucifer, the light bringer. But it is not intrinsic at all that it has to be that way. It is not. And if you are living a life dedicated to God, you can still make mistakes. That does not mean that you are despite God or against God. It just means you're human. That's all. All distinction from God is separation, estrangement, and falling away. And God gave you that distinction. God gave you this temple. He distincted you from the other things. You are still part of it. I just breathed in the Holy Spirit. It is now becoming a part of myself. Those atoms that I breathed in, some of them will not come back out. Some of them will become part of my cell. There is carbon floating around. Some of that carbon is going to be absorbed and used as muscle. That is real, right? The distinction, the separation is part of the experience. That is not necessarily intrinsic opposed to God at all. God's here for the experience too. The fall was inevitable, even in paradise. Yes, that goes back to that contradiction that I was just talking about. Right? God was either ignorant or intended it. There is no other option. Just like when the Jews were in the desert and they rebelled against God, there is no possible way that God was unaware that that was a possibility. Right? Not in reality. And so if this entity, which was calling itself God, might have been Lucifer, right? There was another name, but it might have been the same thing, right? That entity can align that way. But God isn't, right? And so The fall is intrinsic. The people, like, how does God not know when he has given the law to Moses that the Israelites are going to do this, right? But he is completely taken by surprise by it. That is a repeated pattern in Exodus. God is completely taken by surprise by the actions of the humans, which intimates that he does not have an understanding of humanity, because all of their things were perfectly understandable according to their situation. Exodus should not be taken as a literal reading. It is an allegory at best, and it is not a good one at that. Therefore, Christ is without the stain of sin, because he stands for the whole of the Godhead and is not distinct from it by the reason of his manhood. Wrong. 352. A paradox, which, like the kenosis doctrine, is a slap in the face of reason. Yes, it absolutely fucking is. Right? It absolutely is. There is a contradiction intrinsic to this understanding that is unavoidable, unescapable, and unreconcilable. God is the entirety of creation. How did he manifest himself inside of himself? He didn't. He represented himself through a representative, but we are all equal representatives. You are a child of God. I am a child of God. We all have within ourselves the capacity to be the best. No one is, right? Even from the example of Christ, and this one's going to set somebody off, whenever he went back to the temple, the right thing to do would have been to inform his parents prior to it. And therefore, he committed a sin by not honoring his mother and father, by not informing them that he was going back to the temple. That is another problem. There are a lot of problems, right? That is not even the most. That is just one. Man, however, is branded by the stain of separation from God. God separated you. This again is back to the victim mentality. God intentionally created you. He intentionally separated you from himself. He knew you before you were knitted in your mother's womb. He decided you would be separate. This state of things would be unsupportable if there were nothing to set it against evil but the law and the Decalogue, as in pre-Christian Judaism, until the reformer and rabbi Jesus tried to introduce the more advanced and psychologically more correct view that not fidelity to the law, but love and kindness are the antithesis of evil. The wings of the dove temper the malignity of the air, the wickedness of the aerial spirit. The prince of the power of the air, Ephesians 2:2, and they alone have this effect. But that is the wings of the two doves. So that the youth easily entereth in through the pores, and instantly shaketh the foundations of the earth, and raiseth up a dark cloud. 353 is my conjecture. See Supra 2. Now, shaketh the foundations of the earth, that is the understandings thereof, and raises up a dark cloud. That could definitely be taken as the foundations of the earth would be the void underneath, right? And raising up the dark cloud can be the electromagnetic forces that I talk about. There is a white one and a dark one. That is not intrinsically evil, right? Once the malignity is tempered, sinfulness and evil consequences are mitigated too, and that which has wings can embrace the earth. For now we come to the consummation of the hieros cosmos, the earthing of the spirit and the spiritualizing of the earth, the union of opposites, and the reconciliation of the divided. 354. An idea echoed in the dogma of the Assumption, which lays particular emphasis on the incorruptibility of the body, likening it as the earthly vessel of divinity to the Ark of the Covenant. In the Ark of the Covenant, built of incorruptible wood and placed in the temple of God, they perceive an image of the most pure body of the Virgin Mary, preserved free from all corruption of the tomb. That is just you self-inserting some shit. There is nothing about Virgin Mary in the Ark at all. The Ark was a weapon of destruction. The Virgin Mary was the weapon of destruction. Is that? No. The coexistence in heaven of the real earthly body with the soul is expressed unequivocally in the words of the definition. was taken up, body and soul. In a word, the longed-for act of redemption, whereby the sinfulness of existence, the original disassociation, will be annulled in God. The earthquake is on the one hand an allusion to Christ's descent into hell and his resurrection, and on the other hand a shaking of the humdrum, earthly existence of man, into whose life and soul meaning has at last penetrated, and by which he is at once threatened and uplifted. That even concurs with what I describe in the book. This is always an intuitive experience that is felt as a concrete reality. It is the prefiguration and anticipation of a future condition, a glimmering of an unspoken half-conscious union of ego and non-ego. Rightly called a unio mystica, it is a fundamental experience of all religions that have any life in them and have not yet degenerated into confessionalism, that have safeguarded the mystery of which the others know only the rites it produces, empty bags from which the gold has long since vanished. When we were doing one of the studies, I don't remember which one in particular it was, but we came to the conclusion that the Masons have no idea what they are doing when they're doing their ceremonial magic. It was explicit in the text, not even something that I assumed. They do these things with no expectation that they are real. They are transmitters of knowledge, but they have no significant power. They are performing things that they do not know. They do not understand. They are aligning themselves with an entity they do not understand. They are feeding energy into that entity that they do not understand. That is the exact same thing in the Catholic Church. They do all kinds of procedures. Nobody knows what they mean. If you go to a mass, the priest might be in on it, but everybody in the congregation is not. They do not know where that energy is going. They make their assumptions, but they do not know. That energy can go wherever it needs to, wherever it is directed by that priest. And it might be to the correct place, but it might not. And you have no way of discerning those two. If you are not versed in the ceremonies that you are taking explicitly, you should not take part of them. If you do not understand all of the key components to it, you should not take part in it. If you are going to be initiated to the Masons, you should come talk to me first. The earthquake sets up a dark cloud. Consciousness, because of the revolution of its former standpoint, is shrouded in darkness, just as the earth was at Christ's death, which was followed by a resurrection. Though actually, this did not happen. It did not happen. It is recorded in the Gospels, but that is the only place it is recorded. It is not recorded in any of the astrological observations from any of the surrounding countries at all whatsoever. There is no way that this eclipse only affected Jerusalem, right? Israel is a rather small country. It is smaller than most states. Any solar eclipse, especially a full solar eclipse, would be visible in Saudi Arabia. It would be visible in Greece. There is no point whatsoever that that is recorded by anyone. The earthquake, also not recorded. The genocide by Herod, not recorded. These are things that would have been recorded no matter how bad they would have made the Romans look. They recorded all kinds of things that made them look bad. These things would have been recorded. They were not. There is no record of these things. That is a problem. There was no enshrouding in darkness of the earth at Christ's death, which was followed by a resurrection, and that is up for debate as well. This image tells us that the widening of consciousness is at first upheaval and darkness, then a broadening out to the whole man. This man, being indescribable, is an intuitive or mystical experience, and the name anthropos is therefore very apt, because it demonstrates the continuity of this idea over the millennia. But thou wilt lead up the waters, even to the brightness of the moon. As we have seen, water here has the meaning of fructifying interest, and its leading upwards means now turns towards the plenum, the gracious and supreme complement of the sinister new moon and its perils. To me, this pulling up of the waters, even to the brightness, the moon, right? The moon and the void, there is that, but there is a pulling of the waters that occurs. Now, to me, those waters are light and dark in equal measure through the balance of the internal chakras, balancing the virtues and vices every step along the way before doing these processes. That to me is intrinsic in this text. That is not necessarily what he is seeing, but that is not unusual. And the darkness that was upon the face of the deep shall be scattered by the Spirit moving over the waters. Thus, by God's command, shall the light appear. It is important to note that God did not say, "Let there be light." God said, I am the light, and became the light, and the light was good. The eye that hitherto saw only the darkness and danger of evil turns toward the circle of the moon, where the ethereal realm of the immortals begins, and the gloomy deep can be left to its own devices. For the Spirit now moves it from within, convulses and transforms it. When consciousness draws near to the unconscious, not only does it receive a devastating shock, but something of its light penetrates into the darkness of the unconscious. The result is that the unconscious is no longer so remote and strange and terrifying, and this paves the way for an eventual union. Naturally, the illumination of the unconscious does not mean that from now on the unconscious is less unconscious. Far from it. What happens is that its contents cross over into consciousness more easily than before. The light that shines at the end is the lux mordana of the alchemist, the new widening of consciousness, a further step in the realization of anthropos. And every one of these steps signifies a rebirth of the deity. Herewith we end our contemplation of the text. The question now arises, did the alchemists really have such thoughts and conceal them in their ornate metaphors? In other words, did Philalethes, the pseudonymous author of our text, have anything like the thoughts and ideas which I have put forward by the way of interpretation? I hope that I have been clear that there is a different interpretation that is not necessarily to say outright that he was completely wrong in his. There is definitely some wisdom that can be extracted from it. But I do believe that most of his interpretation was a self-insertion into something that is not intrinsically part of it. I may be doing the same thing. I am fully acknowledging my confirmation bias, but it really does line up one for one with the simplicity of my explanation, right? One of the beauties about the things that I believe is the simplicity of it. It is not dependent upon a complicated convolution of events. It is simply taking life as it unfolds and finding the correct thing from it. That is simple, right? The balancing between the virtues and the vices, that is simple. The balance that brings, bringing the balance between the light and the dark, that is simple. All of the parts in my understanding are so simple that I can explain them to a child and the child can understand them, right? That is an intrinsic part of true understanding. If you cannot explain something in a way that anyone can understand at least what you're saying, even if they don't agree, then there's a problem. I feel like my simplistic understanding, as easy as it is, aligns perfectly with the understanding that we have gotten from this chapter about these things. And so I do not agree with his interpretation, although there is value that can be taken from it. He was an intelligent man who spent a lot of time in consideration. Therefore, his thoughts should not be dismissed out of hand. Even if they are not a full understanding, they can help to reach that. I regard this as out of the question, and yet I believe that these authors invariably said the best, most opposite and clearest thing they could about the matter in hand. For our taste and our intellectual requirements, this performance is, however, so unsatisfactory that we feel ourselves compelled to make a renewed attempt to say the same thing in still clearer words. It seems obvious to us that what we think about it was never thought by the alchemist, for it had been, it would doubtless have come out long ago. That is not necessarily intrinsic either. There was definitely a control system enforcing some severe repercussions for anyone talking about the things that I do. If you were in France or Spain back in the 1600s and you decided to talk about anything that is in this book, you would have been burnt at the stake, right? That is a very real reason for hiding your information. That's why there is so much mystery attributed to it, is because of the control systems. And so it was never thought by the alchemist in that particular way, but it is not intrinsic that it would have come out long ago. Even after the Catholic Church and the whole Inquisition era was over, there is still, in the 50s, severe social repercussions for doing these things. They were less, right? You weren't likely to be burnt at the stake, but extrication, isolation, all of these were very real possibilities if you spoke about these things, even from your own community where you grew up, right? If you were born in a small town in middle rural America that was predominantly Christian, and by predominantly I mean almost exclusively, if you decided to become Jew, that was a problem. Much less if you did the things that I talk about, right? It seems obvious to us that what we think about it was never okay. The philosophers took the greatest pains to unearth and reveal the secret of the stone, accusing the ancients of having written too copiously and too obscurely. If they, on their own admission, wrote typus, symbolis, metaphoris, this was the best they could do. And it is thanks to their labors that we are today in a position to say anything at all about the secrets of alchemy. That is in part true, at least. All understanding that is not directly of a mathematical nature, which incidentally understands nothing but merely formulates, is conditioned by its time. Fundamental to alchemy is a true and genuine mystery, which since the 17th century has been understood unequivocally as psychic. Nor can we moderns conceive it to be anything except a psychic product whose meaning may be elicited by the methods and empirical experience of our 20th century medical psychology. But I do not imagine for a moment that the psychological interpretation of a mystery must necessarily be the last word. If it is a mystery, it must have still other aspects. Certainly, I believe that psychology can unravel the secrets of alchemy, but it will not lay bare the secret of these secrets. We may therefore expect that at some time in the future, our attempt at explanation will be felt to be just as metaphorical and symbolical as we have found the alchemical one to be, and that the mystery of the stone or of the self will then develop an aspect which, though still unconscious to us today, is nevertheless foreshadowed in our formulations, though in so veiled a form that the investigators of the future will ask himself, just as we do, whether we knew what we meant. And that is going to bring us to the end of this study. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat difficult concepts. I understand I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. I really do. And I know this is going to sound extremely prideful. I want you to understand that I am acting within humility even when saying this. I do believe that I am here to do this, right? I am here to discern between these things. These studies that I have done, they have been eye-opening. They have shown me how easy it is for me to understand these things, even if other people don't. And I can explain them in a way that is understandable at least to those who do not have the greater knowledge, which by that measure then opens that door to greater knowledge. I feel like I am doing what he is talking about, right? Therefore expect that in some time in the future will be just as metaphorical and symbolical. We just discussed that at length. And then we'll then develop an aspect, though still unconscious to us today, is foreshadowed in our formulations. All I am doing is reading the text and explaining it in a way that is blatantly obvious to me. And that's where I'm going to leave this. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that was stated, put it in the box down below, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of my book where I explain all of this stuff, right, predating any of these studies, or connecting with me directly through Connect. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.